a todos. Buen webinar.
Gracias. Vamos a esperar unos 30 segundos a que entre. Muy buenos días a todos y todas. En nombre del Banco
Good
Interamericano.
morning. On behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank, we want to greet you to the fourth technical dialogue on human trafficking in the Latin American Caribbean region. The event will be in Spanish, English, and Portuguese, and we have simultaneous interpretation services available in all three languages.
Please click the world icon at the bottom of your screen and select the language. Los invitamos a usar nuestro hashtag Se trata de personas y seguirnos en las redes
You
sociales.
can find us in social media at hashtag Se trata de personas. First, we will have our Vice President, Richard Martinez, Countries Division Vice President. Go ahead, Richard. Thank you very much, Adela. Good morning to everyone. On behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank, I'd like to extend cordial greetings to the fourth technical dialogue on human trafficking in the Latin American Caribbean region, in which we will be discussing the link of this phenomena with organized crime and the role that communications can have in preventing. Many of you have participated in sessions related to this series in which we've delved more deeply about different topic areas such as institutional capacity for justice and crime prevention and what we need to do to investigate these cases in a more effective way. Additionally, we need to be able to provide services for victims. Firstly, I'd like to thank all of you for your firm commitment, and those of you who are joining us in this technical dialogue for the first time, welcome. Approximately 40 million people per year are subjected to human trafficking activities, and this is a phenomenon that affects disproportionately girls and women. Human trafficking generates approximately $150 billion per year in profits, which makes it the third most lucrative crime for organized crime, only surpassed by drug trafficking and consumption goods falsification or fraud. Several $100 million is being generated just in the Latin American and Caribbean region alone. We believe that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the problem, along with the economic crisis, greater use of social digital media, and the huge impact to the social and health sectors, and this has expanded the vulnerability that victims have with regard to this phenomenon. Again, girls and women are disproportionately affected. So in this context, I'd like to leave you with three brief messages. First, the IDB's commitment to supporting countries to fight against this plague. Secondly, the need to address the topic and understand it to a much larger extent and create partnerships of collaboration. On the first point, the IDB has been working on a multidisciplinary sectoral approach to try to protect victims and pursue the criminals. Now, this is something that requires the collection of information and the collaboration as well as contribution of financial technical instruments. So we need to be able to address the most basic issues. For example, we don't have reliable numbers for this phenomena in our region. We understand that it operates and takes place with a high degree of invisibility. So as you all know, it's very difficult to address and let alone adequately measure the scale of this activity. And this takes us to the second point that we'll take on today, and that is the complexity makes a multi-sectoral approach very unpredictable. And the idea is for us to protect victims and pursue those delinquents. This is part of our portfolio of activities that we've been working on in the bank when we talk about these issues related to human trafficking with our country members. When we talk about activities, we've undertaken projects in Uruguay dealing with women who have been subjected to human trafficking. Additionally, we have prevention activities in other countries such as Costa Rica. This multi-sectoral approach is very intimately linked to what I mentioned previously. Partnerships among countries and specialized institutions and agencies is paramount. We need to engage in institutional and international collaboration to avoid the duplication of efforts, use our resources more efficiently, create incentives that are properly aligned with interventions, and lastly, address this sort of crime in a much more effective way. Clearly, we need to address the diversity of perspectives from key stakeholders in the public and private sector, as well as civil society. And this allows us to have an integrated vision to address the problem. One example of this is a project that we are currently developing as part of the Public Regional Goods Initiative, which seeks to strengthen the sector's capacity to be more effective in human trafficking interdiction efforts. Many countries are involved in this project, and it's being supported by the U.S. Department of State, CARICOM, Impact from the Caribbean region, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, among other agencies. We understand that the development challenges can be more effectively addressed through collaboration at the regional level. On behalf of the IDB, I want to thank you for joining us today and for your firm commitment to continue to work with us to end human trafficking in our region. You can always count on our support, and we hope to be able to count on you to achieve our goals. Thank you very
Muchas
much.
gracias, Richard. Un honor tenerte en esta apertura.
Thank you,
Ahora
Richard.
vamos a
It's an
ver
honor
una
to
breve
have you
video de
join
muchos
us
temas que
today.
hemos
Now we're
analizado
going to
hasta
see
ahora
a brief
en el
video
área de
that
desarrollo.
discusses many of the topics that we've already mentioned today.
Un segundito de paciencia para que baje
We're going to
nuevamente.
ask everybody to give us just a few more seconds so that we can download the video.
Parece que estamos teniendo un tema con la conexión. Si
It
les
appears
parece,
we're having technical difficulties with our connection. Let's try one more time, and if it doesn't work, we'll get started with our first panel.
El delito de la trata de personas afecta la vida, la
Human
libertad,
trafficking affects the lives, the liberty, and the dignity of more than 40 million people the world over. Women, girls, boys, men silently suffer in this spiral of intimidation, abuse, violence, and degradation. In the Latin American Caribbean region, 75% of identified victims are women and girls. Despite the fact that it's a very difficult phenomena to detect, in recent years we've seen an increase in the number of detected victims and convicted felons. From the IDB group, we are committed to a work agenda that will allow us to prevent and protect the victims from being subjected to this form of crime. The series of technical dialogues on human trafficking has provided a multi sectoral approach, highlighting the importance of collaboration and delving into this sector in a much more effective way. We have the support of strong and resilient institutions to be able to address human trafficking.
The trafficking gets the services they need, and we need to hold traffickers accountable.
Training and awareness campaigns is a critical component in ending human trafficking.
Hablamos del rol del sector privado en la prevención
Talk about the role of the private sector in the prevention and identification of human trafficking and the generation of employment for survivors. We have greater
There is an
difficulties
even
in
greater
installing these people
difficulty
in the
to insert
workforce.
these
That's why it's so
people
important for us to
in
work with companies
dignified
and address
work.
these issues.
Therefore, this is very
We
important.
explore human trafficking online and the dual role of technology that is used by criminals to exploit victims, but it's also key for combating this form of crime.
To maintain them and to develop the capacities of law enforcement to use those tech tools.
abordamos la relación entre trata de personas, migración y
We
tráfico de
address the relationship between human trafficking, migration, and drug traffickers. What these criminals do is observe where there is greatest vulnerability to exploit those persons. What we need is to make migrants more visible in order for us to protect them. We cannot protect that which we cannot see. We delve more deeper into the crucial role of prosecutorial offices in order to protect victims and reduce impunity. The creation of special prosecutors has a direct impact on the benefits for criminal investigations for some of these complex crimes. Continuing to strengthen
y profundizamos en los servicios de
and we
protección
delve more deeply in protection and care services that are key for us to be able to address victims' issues as well as the issues of survivors. Because the majority of these people still have a lot of skepticism with regard to the state and other agencies due to the abuse that they've been subjected to. Today, more than ever, responding to this type of crime is a key element in what we need to do. At the IDB, we are firmly committed to finding the solutions, but we cannot do this alone. And all of these efforts need to ensure that human beings anywhere in the world are not treated like merchandise. That's what this is about. It's about people. Join the dialogue on human trafficking by visiting blogs.iadb.org.
Videos y herramientas de comunicación como lo que acabamos de
Videos
ver.
and communications tools, such as the one we just saw, are a key element in our campaign to address human trafficking. In our next panel, we will discuss some practices to achieve this, and I will yield the floor to my colleague Pablo Bachelet, who will serve as the moderator for this panel. Welcome, Pablo. Thank you very much, Adela. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. And just to echo the words of our Vice President, Richard Martinez, I'd like to extend a cordial greeting to all of the participants who are joining us today here for this fourth technical dialogue on human trafficking in the LAC region. And I'd like to discuss the issue of communications. We understand that human trafficking is a phenomena that does not discriminate against social condition or gender. Nevertheless, there is a disproportionate impact on certain populations. In the LAC region, 3 out of every 4 victims are either women or girls, and criminals use fraudulent offers of employment or use of people who are familiar or even related to these victims to impact them in this activity. For every 100 victims, we don't know about 20 of them. And so we need to look at how we could use communication tools to prevent this sort of crime. And equally important is our ability to create a greater social awareness about this form of crime without placing at risk the victim's integrity. For a number of years, we've begun an effort at the IDB so that the press would provide better coverage for some of these issues of violence. We conducted a number of workshops for journalists, and these were very beneficial because it allowed journalists to understand the impacts to a much larger extent. After that, we started working with law enforcement agents so that they could engage in better prevention measures, and we even created outreach campaigns for law enforcement agencies. But even that was insufficient because other authorities did not intervene. And this takes me to 2 important messages that can be very helpful to address this issue of human trafficking. The first lesson is the importance of strengthening institutional capacity. It's not enough to work with journalists, it's not enough to have a good management for a Twitter account, nor is it sufficient to address issues of crisis. All of these are important, but it's not enough. We have to have well-prepared institutions to be able to address this problem in an effective way. The second issue is trust and the need for us to strengthen it. Trust is something that we're going to be discussing in the panel. Without trust, any communication effort will fall on deaf ears. And while I'm on the subject, we are currently launching an initiative at the IDB on trust, and we are working with several organizations to address this issue. Government in Canada has placed trust at the forefront of all of their communications campaign. In Great Britain, communications is undertaken along 2 different lines. We need to do this to be able to improve trust in the government agencies in that country. The communications in Canada are key for any of the initiatives that the Canadian government wants to undertake, and they need to be able to engender this trust for that communication effort to have more credibility. As part of the work that we've done at the IDB, we've discussed the issue of human trafficking for some time. And in order to ensure that we preclude people from falling into a trap of this nefarious crime, it's essential for us to engage in proper communication. We also need to create adequate messaging without resorting to any judgments or biases to be able to inform people through mass campaigns. We work with ambassadors, and these are key for us to be able to communicate these key messages. Otherwise, the communication through the various channels used by the state are also key. And in this way, we can follow through with safe and secure protocols to be able to reach these victims. These efforts will allow security forces to be able to work hand in hand with the community to respond more effectively to this type of crime. And this relates to the capacity building that I alluded to earlier. Today, our panelists will respond to questions about different ways of communicating and creating awareness for this phenomenon. They will try to maintain the communication effort alive because it's a key element in this struggle. At the IDB, we want to thank you again for joining us today, for taking part in this conversation, and for continuing to support the effort and contribute to ensure that our region and other parts of the world refuses to treat people like merchandise. Thank you. And I yield the floor to you, Robert. Thank you, Pablo. Good morning to everyone. We are extremely excited to begin this first panel on communication strategies, effective strategies to prevent and create awareness related to human trafficking. Before I begin, I'd like to introduce our four panelists. Mónica Botero, Director of the National Institute for Women in Uruguay. Carlos Perez, Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Officer for the Latin American Caribbean region for the UN. Lourdes Fernandez, columnist for the newspaper El Comercio Perú. And Ana Piñeres, General Manager and CEO for the television series La Promesa. I want to thank all of our panelists for accepting the bank's invitation to join us today. As Pablo said, we need to come up with different strategies and communication initiatives in order to prevent potential victims from falling into the hands of these human traffickers. And we need to create greater awareness about this phenomena, which on many occasions happens in plain sight. But the whole phenomena lacks visibility. And we hope that through this dialogue, we'll be able to learn a little bit more about your various approaches to this subject. And you can provide us with knowledge that will allow us to address this type of criminal activity in a more effective way. Before we start, I'd like to tell each one of our panelists that you will have 3 to 4 minutes to answer each one of the questions. I'd like to begin by posing a question to Monica. Monica, the Uruguayan government has developed a guide with recommendations for journalists in terms of communicating or reporting about this sort of phenomena. Can you tell us what was the driving force behind the development of this guide? What was the objective? And what have you achieved so far? Thank you, Monica. Well, good afternoon or good morning to everyone who's joining us here today. I want to thank the Inter-American Development Bank for the invitation to take part in this session. I'd like to clarify that on this occasion, I speak on behalf of the Uruguayan state, given that I'm the director of the National Institute for Women. I did work as a journalist for 35 years, and I worked extensively on gender issues and the communication and awareness campaigns related to that particular topic. So it's an honor to be here with all of these distinguished guests. In Uruguay, we started a project with the IDB 2 years ago, and this was involving the National Institute for Women, the Human Trafficking Division, as well as the directorship that the National Council on Human Trafficking in Uruguay. This was an agency that was created through legislation in 2018. And at that time, we discussed the need to create a communications mechanism or tool for not only journalists, but also different spokesperson for key institutions of the state who had to engage in extensive communication efforts in their own right. We're talking about prosecutors, law enforcement, spokespeople, Ministry of the Interior spokespeople, Ministry of Labor. And the idea was for all of these spokespeople to be able to communicate in an effective and direct way. And of course, keeping in mind that we could not allow for any biases or prejudice in our communications. So part of the campaign involved the production of a video that had some artistic elements, and the idea was for us to be able to create empathy and greater awareness among different audiences where these campaigns were being deployed. But additionally, we developed a specific guide that was published in June of this year, and we can only speak about the impact that this provoked among those who actually received the guide and those people that work in communications that were very grateful to receive this guide with the included recommendations. In Latin America, journalists that report on the news through mass media, where we see that the cases involving human trafficking have a huge impact. These are not people who are specialists in this topic. They may have some training to a certain degree, but they are not considered to be experts. So what we did was develop this guide that could clearly present how we address these issues, including the prejudices and biases in trying to create communication campaigns. Additionally, in Uruguay, prostitution is legal, and this is something that is very intimately tied to this criminal activity. And so we needed to be very careful that we differentiated between prostitution and human trafficking. And the idea was to create this document that would provide more visibility to this phenomenon, not just sexual exploitation focused primarily on women, but also human trafficking as a concept that seeks to enslave human beings. And this includes women, girls, boys, and men. Uruguay is deemed to be a destination country for human traffickers. So this is what was happening just a few years ago. Therefore, as I was stating, this guide focuses primarily on understanding and visualizing the concept of human trafficking. Subsequently, it engages in an exercise on the language that we need to use to be able to inform and report on this subject. And thirdly, the manner in which we use language to create these awareness campaigns. So, parting from that foundation, we created a booklet, which is a booklet that communicators and spokespersons and reporters use to report the news. And we created additional instruments with keywords such as we cannot use the word client, but rather exploiter. The work or the word related to adolescent that engages in prostitution, but instead exploited adolescent or exploited person. We cannot talk about ladies of the night or pimps, but rather sexual exploiters. And of course, some of the concepts that we need to take into account includes human trafficking as news. As part of this effort, many times we fall into the trap of sensationalism. We tend to attack the victims and their families who are also victimized as much as their loved ones. And by engaging in this sort of thing, we are clearly not contributing to the real problem. And there's a great deal to talk about, and I cannot take up any more time, but I'd be happy to send you a digital version of the guide that we developed in Uruguay for any of you who may be interested in learning more about it. Thank you very much, Monica. And I think this is fascinating because what you're talking about with relation to this uh, guide and the recommendations, including the need to line up efforts between government agencies and other stakeholders, including journalists, to try to inform and not so much victimize those who are already victims. And so in Uruguay, we all understand that there are certain complexities in place. And we cannot just think that each country will require a very specific approach to address the issues. You talked about prostitution and how it is a legal practice in your country and that it needs to be handled in a different way in Uruguay. So it's important for us to have a better understanding of this reality, that the work in each country would be very sui generis.
Before I hand the mic over to Carlos, I just wanted to let everybody know that we're running short on time. So let's see if we can give 4 minutes to each speaker. So Carlos, the next question. We know that UNODC has played a key role working with governments around the world to address trafficking in persons at various levels. For example, institutional strengthening, capacity building, which is important, and also working with media campaigns that help to raise an awareness about trafficking in persons and as a challenge. Now, from your perspective, could you just share some reflections regarding those areas where international cooperation, in particular, the UNODC, plays a key role in making more visible and raising awareness on the issues involved related to trafficking in persons, and not just with the traditional media organizations. We'd also like to know, and maybe you could share some of your insights regarding the impacts that the UNODC has had in terms of communication measures in order to prevent trafficking in persons at the regional level. The floor is yours, Carlos. Thank you, Robert. And I'd like to just, first of all, warmly welcome everyone who's on this panel and our audience. I just want to leave a very clear message. The first one is that working in the UNODC, our first responsibility really reflects the mandate handed down by the UN General Assembly, is that's to work and cooperate with governments, with local and regional governments and entities. The mandate that's been handed down is based on the Palermo Protocol, which is the UN protocol to combat trafficking in persons. The Palermo Protocol is also an instrument that enables some interesting processes taking place, dealing with and addressing non-traditional issues. For example, trafficking in persons, it's not just involving law enforcement, judges, prosecutors, civil society. The media also plays a crucial role. And in the mandate received by the UNODC from the UN General Assembly, Article 9 of the Palermo Protocol in particular, and although it's not a part of our daily activities in the media or in the private sector, and yet Article 9 of the Palermo Protocol does call on national authorities to get other stakeholders involved in combating trafficking in persons. And it refers specifically to entities like the media organizations, how they play a crucial part in building and developing the narratives and the rhetoric relating to trafficking in persons. I emphasize Article 9 because I think this invites the media organizations to establish partnerships, not just international cooperation agencies and organizations, including UN agencies, but also to open the door for involving committees, national committees that have responsibilities for developing public policies on trafficking in persons. So Article 9 specifically invites those stakeholders to join in the effort to combat trafficking. So the technical secretariat helps to also make more visible the Article 9 of the protocols in order to help spread and disseminate this. Over the last few years at the UN, we have developed national working groups and also working with entities, many who are with us now. Right now, we have working groups in Mexico and El Salvador and Honduras, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Panama, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil. And I've mentioned these regional offices and working groups because it is in these areas where we can promote and create these partnerships. In addition to that, governments and nations, UN member states have those working groups and task forces dealing with trafficking in persons. These are technical groups and task forces that study the implementation of the protocol and also formulate and provide recommendations. The working group started 12 years ago. The next meeting is going to be on October 12th in Vienna, Austria. And these working groups have formulated 3 specific recommendations relating to trafficking in persons and working in media campaigns. In 2009, the first recommendation focused on establishing in their campaign designs, not only creating a mass message through the mass media, but also campaigns need to focus on the local context. If a nation, an organization, a private sector entity creates a mass media campaign, they can translate it based on the local context, and that includes doing it in native or local languages, addressing also many vulnerable communities spread out throughout Latin American countries where human or trafficking in persons is taking place. Then a second recommendation dating back to 2015 from the working groups is getting other actors from civil society involved in preventive campaigns. You can't be effective in prevention if you don't have these representatives from civil society that provide their interpretation and readings, and other non-traditional actors. In 2017, just I don't want to get too long on this, but there was also an appeal toward fostering investigative journalism in order to measure the positive impacts that investigative journalism can have dealing with trafficking in persons, and also the Justice Department investigations when we have stories of trafficking behind them. So I just also want to point out that in the countries where we have maintained a presence, we have launched various and diverse initiatives working with the UN global campaign to combat trafficking in persons, but there's also local campaigns. For example, in Brazil, we have a program that we supported. In Colombia, another program we're supporting. So we're bringing home the message of trafficking in persons. And with Ana Piñeres, who we established a key partnership in trafficking in persons, and I'm sure we'll be sharing the contents very shortly. Thank you. Thank you very much, Carlos. And we're so pleased that we have 2 panelists that have been a part of that partnership that you just mentioned. So it's interesting to see these kinds of new initiatives and communications initiatives fostered by UNODC with the various stakeholders, where you've been able to actively raise an awareness about the issues involved in trafficking in persons. So I'm so happy to see the efforts undertaken by organizations like the UNODC. And we see this as also with some of the starting points you were talking about in raising greater awareness and following up on Article 9 of the Palermo Protocol. So now my next question is for Lourdes. Does the media play, well, we know that they play an important role. And what about contributing to creating new ideas in an area relating to, well, from your perspective, How do you see the responsible measures by journalists in dealing and covering trafficking in persons? What aspects need to be taken into account so that we don't fall into stereotypes, common stereotypes, prejudice, or sexist rhetoric when we report on trafficking in persons? Thank you, Lourdes. Go ahead. Well, good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank you for this kind invitation. I'd also like to, I'm so very appreciative that we continue to have these dialogues. Very, very welcome. So let's start off with a few considerations. I know that Monica talked about this at the very beginning, looking at the journalist's role. It's very important that the role that we play in journalism, especially given the impact that we are going to generate when we address and cover these topics. In Peru, for example, we have been trying to follow a journalist approach focused on human rights, an approach that is responsible, since most media organizations continue to prioritize sensationalist news, where they always try to scoop there and get the first news and beat out the competition without really thinking about the consequences that this can have, especially on the victims. So one of the first aspects that we need to take into consideration when we cover as journalists trafficking in persons, we need to focus on the human rights priorities and also the gender approach. That's another key pillar that needs to be understood, because we're talking about crimes here. And as was already mentioned earlier, we're looking at women, girls, adolescents who are victims. Most cases, at least in Peru, involving human or trafficking in persons, is driven by sexual exploitation. So you can't have media coverage that only talks about that objective. And that the coverage shows the victims in a total state of vulnerability that really impacts on the dignity of the victims. So when we as journalists look at or cover trafficking in persons, we need to start from the human rights approach at the same time as journalists, beyond just trying to get a scoop or trying to get the news out first. It's also important to ask ourselves, what are the consequences? What's going to happen later with the survivors and the victims? Just to get information about these cases. After publishing these reports, is this going to change that person's life or not? So I think that question is crucial so that we can better measure our potential impact, and also to understand that this is a useful tool in exposing trafficking and at the same time contribute to preventive measures, because people then can see that human trafficking is complex, dangerous, but at the same time, it can be prevented. So that's where we've been focusing our efforts in Peru. The Ministry of Justice and other entities are now involving more journalists so that you can look at the human trafficking from various perspectives. It varies. It may be different contexts and situations on the coast as compared to the hinterland or the mountains. So we need to look at the role of journalism that is, after all, playing the role of communicator. And again, the human rights aspect always needs to be foremost. You're on mute. We can't hear you, Robert. You've muted your microphone, Robert. Sorry. Thank you, Lourdes. And I think you touched on one key issue here. In other words, avoiding sensationalist journalism, which is a risk when we talk about trying to protect the victims of trafficking in persons. And so we walk a very thin line in terms of managing these challenges. We need to ensure and protect the victims. So thank you very much, Lourdes. Let's now move on to Ana. Another major tool relating to communication is to create narratives and stories that people can identify with. I know that you have produced this story. It's where you have three victims, three women from two different countries, two Colombians and a Mexican. We'd like to know, with this program that you've produced, could you talk about that series? How did the idea come about for this TV series as a producer? Was it, what were you trying to visualize through these characters? What are some of the key takeaways and messages from your TV series? Thank you, Ana. Well, thank you, Robert. Well, my production company has been working for the last 20 years on these things, and we've always focused on ensuring that we know that entertainment is a huge conduit for providing messages about our daily lives. We're not creating series that don't have some social message and background that people can identify with, and also creates conversations and that can contribute to making change, meaningful change among our societies. So we created this story, the history of the promises, and we saw in the news constantly in Colombia how young people, adolescents would disappear. These girls, they would disappear. We didn't know what happened to them. So we started investigating this, and we began seeing cases of trafficking in persons. And we envisioned how the lives of these three girls in the middle of this online trafficking that Pablo already mentioned, they get these people through online trafficking, and they take them to Spain, and they put them in this trafficking ring for sexual exploitation. That's how I know Carlos Perez, because at that time he was working with the UN, the UNODC in Colombia, and he gave us amazing accounts, all of these files where we found some significant cases. Of course, all of this was handled in total confidentiality, but we thought that here we do have a story to tell. So the story is where these three women are taken to Spain, forced into prostitution. But we also found that it wasn't just trafficking, sex trafficking. We also saw cases of migrant trafficking, where people were forced into forced labor situations. So we put that in our show as well. There are different types of trafficking. There's a woman, for example, who was forced to marry an older man, and that's another type of trafficking. So we saw many different nuances. So the series was filmed in 4 countries, and it generated a lot of crucial information. I think it also created more trust in the information with the public. So it's key in these series that we produce. We need to have, of course, and we have those who are broadcasting this content. We have a lot of responsibility, because through entertainment, we're able to reach out more effectively to the homes and of the people that need this information. Of course, you also have documentary programs and TV journalism, but through entertainment, you also shine a light on things that sometimes are hard to accept or people may not want to see a documentary, people may not want to read an article or a book about it, but through an entertainment program, then people will pay attention. And this was through Caracol Television, our partner for whom we produced the series. It was seen by many people. And it also came out in DVD in Mexico, one of the other countries that have been impacted by human sex trafficking. So ultimately, the content always needs to address these types of topics. And that's what we did with our TV series and our production company. Thank you very much, Anna. Let's move on to the second round of questions. I think we're a little behind our schedule, so we'll need to stick to our time allotment. Let me get back to Monica. We have heard from our panelists about different ways of creating communication and conduits and broadcasting to raise an awareness and prevent trafficking in persons. But it also helps to people, it encourages people to report these crimes and also to ask for help. Could you just tell us some of the media campaigns launched by the government of Uruguay in order to raise that awareness to victims about where they can get help? Go ahead, Monica. Well, actually, two things I wanted to mention there. We know that at the beginning, there was a lot of discussion on building trust. And I think that that's essential. You need to have those who are broadcasting this information. Those communicators need to build trust and confidence with the community, because this could encourage women who are victims of trafficking to ask for help from government authorities. And it's building that trust that will be vital to help get them out of that trafficking bind. Also, they may be able to help in detecting human trafficking rings and other criminal organizations. Regarding media campaigns and awareness raising campaigns, we are now involved in a project. This is at the Mercosur level, where we work in unison with Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, where on the border posts, as well as not just land borders, but also airports, we will put up posters that will explain how you can detect or spot situations involving trafficking in persons. And there are going to be 4 hotlines, telephone lines that are free, 1-800 numbers, where you can call and report incidents of or suspected incidents of human trafficking. So beyond just transmitting a message, we're able to provide information about how we in government would respond to these cases, to these situations, in terms of providing help to people who are in need, as well as what information or where they can provide information that they may have about local issues. I could go on in more detail, but I wanted to make sure that I kept with the time allotment you talked about. Now, of course, I wanted to add that the campaign that we have launched deals with trafficking in persons. We try to explain when you, for example, you look at suspected situations, especially in terms of trafficking in women, we emphasize that, of course, it is a crime. What's going on is a crime, and people that request help do not need to feel guilty. Nobody is going to prosecute them. Nobody's going to accuse them of anything. They will be treated as victims. That needs to be made known. Thank you, Monica. Very important remarks. I'd like to ask Carlos about some of his media campaigns and preventive campaigns. Maybe you could discuss some of the lessons learned from your media and communication campaigns in order to prevent human trafficking. What are some of your key recommendations from UNODC in terms of designing future media and awareness raising campaigns? And also, like your perspective on the implementation and follow-up of these media campaigns. Thank you, Robert. I'm going to try to be very specific. There are actually two recommendations, maybe two takeaways that we've documented based on our own experiences in the region. When I say we've documented, it's not that detailed, but we've given a sort of a balance of the actions. The first thing I mentioned in my earlier intervention is that to make sure that we also reach out to non-traditional actors. Many messages revolving around preventive measures were focused only on vulnerable groups in specific regions in a given country. But when you reach out in your media campaign to non-traditional actors and non-traditional locations, you find a lot of surprises. In our prevention campaigns, we reach out to, for example, in public transportation, metros, areas where the message can be broadcast, and it's not in a traditional setting and not a traditional location, not through TV. This can sometimes be a game-changing measure in terms of providing prevention information. The other thing we've seen is that messaging was usually focused on the victims of trafficking in persons. Yet after we talked to many of them, many of the victims, especially victims of sexual trafficking, they said that the decision to finally change and that they said that the message would have been more effective if they had reached out to families and people who are closely associated with potential victims to help prevent these, and that would have been much more effective in helping victims. Another recommendation that should be carefully studied and analyzed in the region is how we can link up the human conduct studies with preventive campaigns. We find that prevention campaigns need to focus on changing behavior patterns and practices, not just of people in general, men, women, children, adolescents, but also in those officials who have access to these cases. I think there we need to have some academic studies to see how we can conduct these campaigns that would discourage the demand for human trafficking. So that's something we could also link up to our media campaigns. I also wanted to mention, and I think this goes hand in hand with what I just said, how can we reach not only non-traditional locations, but also use non-traditional media, TV, films, radio, theater? How can we conduct that how can we be innovative so that we can transform our messaging? Thank you very much, Carlos, for your recommendations. And now I would like to focus on journalist communication. I know that you have published a report and I think this report won several awards from organizations that are involved in dealing with trafficking in persons. Could you briefly discuss this report? We know that the report has various components. You have the documentaries, you have photographic data in articles. Could you share why you decided to broadcast these stories using such a diverse media? Thank you very much, Lourdes.
I'll try to be brief, but this was a multimedia reporting campaign that, as you mentioned, used various platforms and mediums. We had the main message, and then we had a video about a report with a documentary style to it, and we tried to present what happened with survivors or surviving victims after being rescued. Most of the information that we use in mass media in Peru is that we always report about the law enforcement effort, that when there's a rescue at some place, at some kind of diversion center, and victims are rescued, little was known about what happened to those people. And so we decided to go out and to look for those women and girls. And based on this previous protocol of understanding the psychological, emotional state of each victim, we wanted to see how feasible it would be for us to get them to share their stories. And as journalists, that's something that we realized right away. We needed to try and communicate with them, but we need to be very careful about how we can generate empathy and trust. And we also needed to work this out in advance. And so we wanted to answer that question. And we went to Loreto, which is a region in the jungle area in our country. We found 3 cases of 3 young women who were victimized by trafficking activities. They were in shelters, given that there was a lack of real intervention by the state in some of these types of cases. And so we were able to reach them and get their testimonials. And the title of Slaves Without Change came about because we can see that there's a myth, or there's this misconception that victims of human trafficking are women who are chained, who are tied down, that are physically restricted from leaving the location wherever they find themselves. But in truth, there's an emotional and psychological repression taking place. And these victims many times can be surrounded by family members, but they are enslaved to this type of influence. And many times, even when you talk to the victims, many of them don't recognize themselves as victims. They have their protector. There are many cases where they tend to think that they're in love with their so-called exploiter slash protector. And so it's very difficult for us to identify these cases and make them understand that they needed some form of protection. And once we took this into account, we started referring to this term as slaves without chains. And the reporting was conducted through video media. And this was something that we worked on for about a month in Loreto. And it was complicated trying to access these different people, given the locations where they found themselves. As Ana stated, many of these cases tend to be very complex, and we need to understand that. That's important in order for us to try to tell the story to the general public and create awareness. We need to do some preliminary work. So all this process took about a month, and this was just for a 10-minute report. So it took a month for us to produce 10 minutes worth of reporting. Then we went to other media, and we focused on the city of Lima. We looked at police files that spoke about victims that had been housed in shelters, and many of them had gone back to the exploitation chain. So we addressed this from 2 standpoints, both audiovisual and a different online approach. So that's what we did. I hope I was brief enough. Thank you very much, Lourdes. And since we are a bit short on time, and I have some questions for Anna at the end, I'd like to move on to Anna for this third round. But before, we'll talk to Monica to have her discuss a little bit about the government's role in this. And I wanted to ask you if you could share some of the outcomes or results that you've seen as a result of the campaigns undertaken by the Uruguayan government to try to create awareness around some of these ideas related to human trafficking among society in that country. Monica? Well, at the present time, we are currently evaluating the results of that campaign or these campaigns. These are relatively recent. The oldest of these campaigns is only 2 years old. So we're still analyzing the data, anything that we could measure in terms of impact includes the non-systemized evolution of these public actors. So I think that all of the campaigns were very well received by a very broad audience. Many people even expressed appreciation for the work. At present, we're still looking at the various metrics, trying to measure all of the results. We've seen a fundamental qualitative change in the approach that we see in journalistic reports that relate to these types of situations. Of course, we're talking about cases that, with the advent of the pandemic last year and the difficulties that we've seen over the course of this last year and a half, we've seen some challenges with regard to identification of cases and, of course, the prosecution thereof. Clearly, we've seen a great deal of improvement in providing services for victims of trafficking. At present, we have three different agencies working on providing services, and we're developing a fourth branch, and this has allowed us to improve our coordination, especially with the different prosecuting agencies with whom we have excellent communication and coordination to be able to address the issue of detecting these situations. Additionally, at the present time, we are currently developing more than one, but primarily one campaign in the central region of the country where we are building the Finnish manufacturing plant that will produce paper, cellulose. This is located near a small town. It was only perhaps a town with 1,000 residents, but because of the construction of this manufacturing plant, 5,000 workers arrived in that location. As a result, both the public agency representatives and the corporations representatives, as well as civil society, all together partner to deploy a communication and awareness campaign that is focused on the exploitation of adolescent boys and girls. One of the key actions that we've developed, for example, in conjunction with UPM, the manufacturing corporation, is that as part of their training process, in their onboarding process for any employee that will work for the company, they work both for the manufacturing company as well as for the construction company that is building the plant site. They are all subjected, or rather, they are all shown an 8-minute video as part of their onboarding process that relates to the legal and human consequences that apply if they were to engage in any exploitative behavior against women or girls or adolescent girls. This is something that has had, we believe, a very huge impact on these employees and how there are measures in place that exist to intervene in these cases. So there's a wonderful commitment between the private sector and with other public agencies as well as civil society in that area. Thank you very much, Monica. These clarifications that you just made are very important and they help us understand a little bit better the type of work that you engage in. Now I'd like to go back to Carlos, and I'd like to ask you, Carlos, in this sense, how the UNODC can report on the impact that your awareness campaigns have in the region as it relates to human trafficking. Well, measuring impact for awareness campaigns continues to be a challenging effort in the LAC region. We're trying to see how the trafficking issue has taken on a higher priority for public agencies. Today's session is an example of this, given the participants. And what we've seen and observed in the region is that the narrative around human trafficking, the need to address this issue, is more and more evident in public agencies, and this reinforced the commitment of all of the key stakeholders that work under the purview of the Palermo Agreement to move forward with this initiative. One thing that we want to do is link prevention campaigns that have a call to action with the number of cases identified in any specific area. And that is something that goes hand in hand with the previous comment related to how we engage in these awareness campaigns. And so the possibility of including the different hotlines, emails to be able to report cases to the relevant authorities is a key element of the campaign and also allows us to measure the impact, especially when we count or measure the number of reports that we get through those various media. Another thing related to the awareness aspect, of course, is the communication, but I think this is one of the key mechanisms that will allow us to transform the incorporation of hotlines and different contact information to be able to report these cases whenever people on the ground see them. Thank you very much, Carlos. I think that the issue of measurement of the impact for these campaigns is a key issue. Thank you for your comments. So now I'd like to move on to Lourdes for the last question. I wanted to ask you from your journalistic standpoint, how do you think that journalism can create greater impact in creating awareness among citizens, but also government agencies? How can we create greater sensitivity and partnerships through journalistic reports to try to address this issue of human trafficking? 2 minutes, Lourdes. Well, as I stated at the beginning, I think that we as journalists and reporters have a very key role in prevention. And when we talk about awareness, as Ana Piñeres was mentioning, the issue of presenting the information through narratives and stories creates a better bond with the audiences. This is very important that we've started to see in some of the reporting that when we talk about stories, we're really talking about something that is related to facts, something that really relates very closely to the personal experience of the audience, because people don't realize how close they are to the problem. And when we do it in that way, there's a greater impact. Clearly, it's important for us to include the context, introduce statistics and information. But we need to understand that people understand that human trafficking is not a single illegal activity. And when we do this, especially in the journalistic arena, we need to use different stories and narratives that adapt to different situations. At the present, we are experiencing a pandemic, a huge crisis, and we've had to adapt to those circumstances. And there are other modes to be able to carry out this communication effort. Now, this is something that needs to be disseminated through a broad variety of platforms. And we cannot just simply rely on the traditional media to communicate our stories. Now, in recent years, as an initiative driven by the Ministry of the Interior, when we talk about human trafficking in Peru, the, we've seen the initiation of campaigns and workshops for journalists so that we journalists can have a more human approach and a more sensitive approach when we report some of these cases. Additionally, there have been some workshops within the communication media arena. Nevertheless, this is still a very large challenge because we don't see the amount of interest that Peruvian journalists really should have on this issue to be able to focus, adapt to, and specialize in this subject of human trafficking. And unfortunately, the only thing we have are these human trafficking workshops and the struggle against human trafficking. And the truth is that we need to incorporate this into everybody's agenda. It is a challenge. I think we are moving towards that. There's a lot more willingness by the various ministries that have jurisdiction over these issues and other agencies that are trying to create spaces for a dialogue that will address the issue of human trafficking. Thank you, Lourdes. And I'd like to pose a final question to Ana. I'd like to talk about the victims of trafficking that are part of the LGBTQ community, Ana. There's been a great deal of emphasis on diverse populations. One of those populations is the LGBTQ plus population, and we're talking about trans women exploitation. Cultural issues play a key role in this space, and many times the dialogue can be difficult, and especially reaching out to audiences can be a particularly difficult task because there's little awareness about all of these issues. In La Promesa, when you address issues related to human trafficking, based on our conversation from last week, you told me that you've been working on a project that seeks to address different topic areas, especially areas related to trans women. Can you tell us a little bit about this new project and what are the lessons learned as part of the production process for La Promesa? How do you engage in communicating the storylines behind such complex topics? Well, undoubtedly, we work with storytelling primarily, and the raw material for fiction is the human condition, especially human conditions that are not customarily reflected in the content of media in general. I think that creators in the television industry have a huge pyramid of important content and narratives. And as you stated, we are about to produce a movie called En el Verde Mar, which is based on work from Jorge Enrique Botero. And it talks about a trans woman's story who is taken to serve in the military. And in her documentation, her gender is not established as that of a woman. Genetically speaking, she is a man. And during her military service, she is kidnapped. And in the midst of a battle, being a soldier in that moment, she falls in love with a captain in her regiment. And so this is something that happens here in Colombia. And this type of story allows us to relate how trans women don't really have any respect in the military arena. And they're basically categorized by their gender at birth and not so much by their sexual identity. And like that one, we have other issues such as the ones we addressed in La Promesa. I think that the lesson learned based on the question that you asked, a very important lesson that we had in that series that stemmed from one of the collaborators in the production company who told us, Ana, she said, Ana, thank you for what you mentioned in La Promesa, because some of these elements that you included are like the vital signs, because these allow us to capture the essence of this girl, how they behave, and you explain what's happening in their day-to-day lives. And we realized, based on what you presented in La Promesa, that this was happening in our own home. And we realized that this was happening when the young girl had a packed bag and was about to leave with one of these exploiters, one of these abusers. So thanks to your show, we were able to identify some of these signs, and we were able to protect our daughter from a fate, perhaps maybe even worse than death. And so this tells you how narrating a single story, a single experience can have a huge impact in trying to address human trafficking. And what we're trying to put up on the screen in the new series related to trans women that are still treated to humiliation, and they are subjected to abuse in their day-to-day lives because they are deemed to be men and their sexual identity is not really respected. Well, that's marvelous, Anna. Thank you so much for regaling us with your wonderful stories. And we are extremely excited not only about the existing series, but the upcoming series as well. We are very excited to hear about your upcoming work, and we are very happy to have you join us to share some of these experiences. So with this, we will then end our panel, and I want to thank all of the participants who joined us today for your time and for sharing your knowledge, and not just knowledge, but also sharing your passion with regard to this very important subject area. Clearly, the point of all of this is to create partnerships and maintain this dialogue active. We have and will have much more effective, diverse, and profound solutions and responses to be able to address an issue as complex as human trafficking. So with that, I'd like to yield the floor to Adela, thanking everybody for joining us for this panel and for joining us for this dialogue. Thank you very much, Robert, and congratulations for the impressive work that our panelists are engaged in. We are all very excited, worried also, but very, very excited. Thank you very much. So before we move on to the second panel, we want to thank the more than 230 participants who have joined us from the entire region here today. And we'd like you to help us by answering a brief survey. It shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes, and your feedback would be very useful and is very important for us. And so we'd like you to just take an image of these QR codes on the screen and just answer this survey for us because it'll be very helpful for our efforts. Thank you.
I'm only happy when it rains. I'm only happy when it's complicated. And though I know you can appreciate it, I'm only happy when it rains. You know I love it when the news is bad. Why it feels so good to feel so sad. I'm only happy when it rains. Pour your misery down. Pour your misery down on me. Pour your misery down. Pour your misery down on me. I'm only happy when it rains. I feel good when things are going wrong. I only listen to the sad, sad songs. I'm only happy when it rains. I only smile in the dark. My only comfort is the night gone black. I didn't accidentally tell you that. I'm only happy when it rains. You get the message by the time I'm through. When I complain about me and you, I'm only happy when it rains. Pour your misery down. Pour your misery down on me. Pour your misery down. You can keep me company as long as you don't care. I'm only happy when it rains. You wanna hear about my new obsession? I'm riding high upon a deep depression. I'm
Muy buenas tardes y muchas gracias
Good
por seguir.
afternoon, and thank you for staying with us. I remind you that we are using hashtag Se Trata de Personas. Next, we will begin our second panel. Human trafficking, organized crime, and associated crimes. The human trafficking network collaborate with other criminal enterprises within the illegal framework affecting a broader number of people. And through certain financial resources and instruments, we can track these financial transactions and use them to dismantle some of these networks. For this reason, I will now yield the floor to our colleague Roberto de Michele, who is the coordinator for the cluster for the Transparency Division of Innovation for the IDB. Welcome, Roberto. Thank you very much, Adela. Thank you for the invitation. We all know that we have simultaneous interpretation services available. It's very hard to maintain or follow a brilliant panel such as the one that just ended. And when we started talking about some of these television series that are so educational and so important for our communication and awareness campaigns, on this panel, I think that we're going to be looking at the issue in a complementary way, but nonetheless important way. And that is, in what way can we sometimes link worlds that don't necessarily talk to each other? I come from the anti-corruption and money laundering sector. And as you all know, we have international rules and standards that we use for international financial transactions. and these provide oversight as well as policies for promoting full transparency in the financial sector. Among these standards, we have criminal activity that can be predicted, or we can also associate different types of criminal activities. Much of this relates to money laundering efforts, and these are intimately tied to human trafficking. Today, we're going to be discussing a topic that focuses on the conversation related to countries and the manner in which they approach this subject and how we could improve on their efficiency if they worked in a closer way. Obviously, this is not an easy task because the usual actors, financial intelligence units, have to work on a very strict and rigorous confidentiality framework, but they still need to collaborate with security forces, prosecutorial ministries, and special prosecutors. One of the things that is of key importance for us is how we magnify the problem to create greater awareness among different countries.
So, working with Latin America and the Caribbean, we focus on these projects in asset laundering. And sometimes it's hard to find data to see how the trafficking in persons with asset laundering, how that can bring additional risk. This is a fabulous panel, by the way, because we're going to be attempting to look at these multiple perspectives. So without further ado, what I'm going to try to do is perhaps anticipate a little bit of the discussion, and I'd like to offer the floor to my colleague, Ms. Alvarado, so that she can, now Natalie Alvarado is going to introduce our panelists. Go ahead. Thank you very much, Roberto, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this new panel discussion. As Roberto has indicated, this is an honor to be hosting this discussion. So I'd like to first welcome Don Spicer, Executive Director of the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. Also, Kiki Roberts from the Office of the UK government's Organized Crime Policy Coordinator for Latin America. Then we also have Gaston Schulmeister from the Organization of American States. Then we also have Laura Roteta, co-head prosecutor of the Office of the Prosecutor for Economic Crimes and Money Laundering, PROCELAC from Argentina. Thank you very much for kindly accepting our invitation to discuss your experiences. As Roberto has already indicated in terms of the links between trafficking in persons with other crimes, including asset laundering. So as the vice president clearly stated, that in addition to the major impact, the painful impact in the lives of the victims of people, victims of human trafficking, it also has a major economic impact. In fact, it is the third most lucrative crime. And basically, after drug trafficking and cyber crimes, it generates $150 billion annually. It is estimated that money laundering moves the equivalent of 2 to 5% of global GDP, and between 5 and 7% of GDP in Latin America. So this is one of the key challenges that we're faced with. So the discussion will allow us to explore some of the challenges, opportunities, advances, as well as tools. For example, financial intelligence services to help detect and identify those groups involved and networks with regards to asset and money laundering, to also try to eliminate any possible impunity for those who are guilty. So I just want to remind our panelists that we have about 3 to 4 minutes for each panelist to discuss these issues. in our dialogue. So I would like to welcome Dawn.
And we really look forward to hearing the perspective of the financial sector and its contribution to combating trafficking in person. To start, first, please tell us more about the work of the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. And please elaborate on the challenges of this task force and the financial intelligence units. Sometimes they face a lot of problem in their work, and specifically we want you to focus in the region that we work with. And also please tell us about how COVID has affected your work in the region.
Okay, good morning, good day everyone. Thank you, Natalie. First, I'd like to thank the IDB for its invitation to participate in this important dialogue on a crime that impacts the Caribbean region. A 2019 CARICOM report indicates that between 80,000 to 120,000 persons are trafficked through the Caribbean each year. So it is certainly something that we are cognizant of and that we are building towards doing more on. The primary function or work of the CFATF is to conduct mutual evaluations to ascertain the level of compliance by member countries with the international FATF standards for countering money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. Human trafficking is one of the 21 designated categories of offenses that forms a for money laundering in terms of a predicate offense for money laundering. The CFATF is currently engaged in its fourth round of mutual evaluations and has thus far published 10 mutual evaluation reports, which can be found on our website. We also provide technical assistance and training to assist members in improving their anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, and proliferation financing systems. With regard to financial intelligence units, they are an extremely important component of members' AML CFT systems. You can think of them as the cog in the wheel that supports the anti-money laundering, countering financing of terrorism framework. As required by FATF Recommendation 29, they receive, analyze, disseminate financial intelligence based on STRs, suspicious transaction reforms that are received, and also other information that might be provided by law enforcement agencies. In the region, we have both administrative and hybrid financial intelligence units. The administrative financial intelligence units tend to stick to the receipt, analysis, and dissemination. And that dissemination is usually outside of the administrative unit to other law enforcement and investigative authorities. While for the hybrid, usually it's a combination of an administrative model with the law enforcement model that is within our region. So it allows them to have the ability to both generate financial intelligence and also to conduct financial investigations, with one or two of them also being able to prosecute matters that come out of those investigations. Challenges to CFATF and FIU work. Generally, the fourth round is a risk-based approach to assessing countries' frameworks to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. National risk assessment has been an important aspect of that. It's a very resource intense, both in terms of human resource, in terms of data that is needed to do that. And of course, this has been made more difficult by the pandemic, where you have health and safety restrictions in terms of social distancing, work from home, etc. And also measures where persons working from home may not have the internet connection so that they could meet in groups and forward this. For us, the pandemic led to the postponement of all our on-site mutual evaluations for 2020. We are now holding them this year, thankfully, in a hybrid format, which means part is physical and part is virtual. There's also been increased costs due to that, with increases in airfare, hotel, quarantine requirements, and also testing requirements. For FIUs, the pandemic has push them towards greater use of technology in terms of the receipt of suspicious transaction reports. But again, they still have to have a manual aspect because they're smaller entities that may not be so sophisticated to have all the technological capacity or requirements to submit STRs. Work from home or on a rotational basis has also had an impact on FIU response times, with responses being prioritized based on risk and the availability of information. There have also been limits on the amount of strategic and operational analysis conducted, since remote access to FIU's databases is not allowed for security reasons. Where FIUs have a supervisory functions, in some jurisdictions they supervise DNFDPs, the on-site aspect of that supervision has been put on hold, with all that supervision occurring desk-based. So that's a challenge, and that's probably a downside in terms of looking and addressing risk as soon or as fast as they should. In general, for COVID-19, we saw increases in fraud, fake PPE and surgical mask scams, pyramid scams, cybercrime, unregulated financial services, and insertion of illicit funds into businesses because of the economic impact of COVID-19. The risk of human trafficking also increased due to the migration and the significant negative economic impact in all business sectors. So I hope that gave you, in a nutshell, basically what we do and what the impact has been. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Very, very, very interesting. We're going to follow up with some points that you touched upon regarding coordination between the Financial Intelligence Unit, and I think is very relevant with the law enforcement, as well as the restriction of data and the analysis capabilities. Thank you, Dawn. Now, let's continue with Kiki. Welcome to this dialogue, and we are very glad to have the perspective and experience of the United Kingdom in this meeting. Kiki, will you please walk us through the work of the Organized Crime Policy Unit for Latin America, and how does the work in our region fit within the umbrella of the global strategy designed in London?
Yes, I'm very happy to. Thanks very much, Natalie, and thanks very much to the IDB for inviting me here today. Honoured to be here amongst such an impressive panel as well, so thank you. In terms of the UK government's approach to tackling serious and organised crime, we take a full spectrum approach and work to what we call a 4Ps model. So this is prevent, protect, prepare and pursue, which includes a full sort of spectrum of interventions. So working to prevent people from becoming involved in serious and organised crime, SOC, the acronym for that, which I'll probably slip into as we go, to protecting vulnerable people, operations and systems, to reducing harm caused by providing support to victims, and pursuing offenders through prosecution and disruption. And this is the same model we use as well for our counterterrorism work, for example. Our serious and organised crime strategy, which we published in 2018, also sets out, linked to some of the work just mentioned previously, our follow the money approach to tackling serious and organised crime, where an effective way to undermine the business models of serious and organised crime groups is to attack their finances in what is otherwise a very complicated space. And these finances cut across obviously every sort of step of the organised criminality. So our approach is inherently cross-government, and it includes departments and agencies you would expect. So in the case of modern slavery and human trafficking, talking about law enforcement, working with border and migration officials in how to identify falsified documents, how to identify characteristics of people who could be at risk at a range of contact points, but also importantly those sort of points which traditionally don't have serious and organised crime as their main objective of their work. So here we're thinking about transport departments such as haulage of container traffic as enablers of crime, military forces with links to border security, for example. And so far as my role kind of as a piece within that, I'm part of a network covering over 100 countries, comprised of regional coordinators such as myself and illicit finances leads in global financial centres, so combining the two approaches there. And we look at a range of crime areas, aiming to work together with national and international partners to do a number of things such as further knowledge, promote coordinated responses. So across diplomatic, programmatic, developmental and operational space. And that's the model we apply nationally and within each region. And if I may quickly finish by saying that in terms of a practical step about what that actually means, one of the pieces of work we're sort of looking at is developing threat assessments to gauge the threat from crime areas and from particular sources. So we then use this 4P strategy, which I set out a moment ago, to develop potential responses and prioritize those accordingly. So one approach we're taking is pioneering a joint threat assessment where we as the UK government work with partner countries to share information on mutual threat areas and mitigation strategies to then deal with them. And this helps highlight also capacity challenges and where the UK can support other governments or convene an international response. And another important part of that as well is working with non-state actors, so working with legal professionals, social workers, community leaders, transport operators, who will have a really important role to play in protecting victims and attacking prosecutors. And thank you.
No, thank you, Kiki, and congratulations. Really, this is very comprehensive work from the United Kingdom. And the emphasis on having this threat assessment, I think is fantastic. It's basically to anticipate us to the problem and to have a better diagnosis. Thank you very much. Ahora nos vamos con Gastón. Bienvenido.
Let's move on to Gaston. Welcome. Thanks for joining us in this dialogue. We know that the OAS is a major partner working with IDB in terms of citizen security and looking at, well, just to begin with, Gaston, could you discuss how the OAS addresses trafficking in persons, especially from the financial crimes aspect? Any experiences? What are some of the success stories that you have had that you could share with us today, Gaston? Go ahead, the floor is yours. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Natalie. I'd like to thank the IDB for giving us this opportunity on behalf of the OAS and the Department to Combat Transnational Organized Crime. At the OAS, we have been involved in efforts to combat trafficking in persons throughout the hemisphere, especially in preventive measures and also helping to prosecute and again, combat transnational organized crime. But in terms of the financial investigative units, just want to highlight the work undertaken with OAS member states within the group of experts, for example, in dealing with money laundering, also known as SHELABEC by its acronym, where we work operationally with a working task force of financial crimes investigation. And in that regard, it's important to be aware not just of the efforts that financial intelligence units undertake, but also the rest of the associated authorities. That includes prosecutors, it includes law enforcement agencies. And just to talk about some of our success stories and outputs, in 2019, SHELABEC developed a study covering illicit migrant trafficking and how it was associated with money laundering. So as a result of studies undertaken by the group, 18 member states of the OAS shared information. And looking at the situations that most stood out in the diagnostic study, we found, first of all, 84% of countries identified that illicit migrant trafficking and trafficking in persons were the basis for money laundering. Secondly, of the countries that have published these crime statistics, 52% have actually sentencing for money laundering, which another 42% that were based on human trafficking. Thirdly, of the countries that have conducted investigations of these money laundering activities, there are more investigations of money laundering coming from human trafficking sources than from illicit migration trafficking. And among these statistics, half the countries stated that the most difficult thing to do is to try to prove that the illicit assets come from the human trafficking. So based on the studies from Shelabek, but based on their proposals to improve prosecutions for human trafficking and illicit migrant trafficking and money laundering, we find the following. Every time the migrant trafficking and trafficking in persons is identified, there always needs to be a follow-up in looking at asset and money laundering. Also, it's linked to remittances from a country of origin and a destination country. Also, the trafficking in persons and migrants generate significant profits that should not be discarded when investigations are undertaken in money laundering. In some occasions, the illicit activities that are involved in trafficking in persons are also devoted to drug trafficking. That's why, in order to dismantle these organizations, they need to break that vicious circle. So the Shelabek group has become a very specific tool to address this at the hemispheric level, and we're open to try to establish the most successful partnerships with other stakeholders in dealing with trafficking in persons. We also working and joining efforts with the IDB, and we're very pleased to do that. Thank you, Gaston, and congratulations for your excellent work. You've provided us with vital statistics, which is, we really need that if we want to know exactly where to start in focusing our efforts. You just mentioned regarding the need to work together. There's a huge potential with all the efforts undertaken by our respective organizations, which is focused on eliminating trafficking in persons. The next question is actually our next speaker is going to be Laura Roteta. Thank you very much, Laura, for being with us today. And to begin, could you just discuss your work, the Office of Economic Crimes and Money Laundering in Argentina? What role does the prosecutor play in these specific cases? How do you coordinate efforts between your prosecutor's office and other agencies in dealing with organized crime? Go ahead, Laura. Well, thank you. Good afternoon. It's already noon here, and it's a pleasure for me to be here as I represent the prosecutor's office. This is the special prosecutor on money laundering and terrorist financing. Let me just start off with a brief understanding so you get a clear idea of the context of the prosecutor's office. Argentina is a federal republic, and as a result, we have various administrative systems and procedures based on the number of provinces, but we also have a federal justice system. So both trafficking in persons and money laundering in Argentina are both considered federal crimes. So the processes implemented and conducted against these crimes has to be sometimes coordinated with the local authorities and jurisdictions, but in the system that we have at the federal level is a system that is a mixed system where the investigation is undertaken by judges and administrative and examining magistrates. However, we are now focusing more on an accusatory justice system where you have a division of responsibilities where the federal prosecutor is focused, but now we have oral proceedings that includes all of the mediation efforts that are well known. So this has already been introduced in the jurisdiction of Jujuy and is going to be expanded to the other jurisdictions. In the future, at the federal level, it's going to be actually expanded because of the caseload. In Argentina, The federal prosecutor is an independent entity and autonomous. So in that system, the prosecutors have been designed to address and help prosecutors, the federal prosecutors, in complex investigations. And these prosecutors encompass all these areas where you have organized crime involved. For example, you have a special drug prosecutor, you have a corruption prosecutor, and you have a trafficking in persons prosecutor and economic crimes prosecutor. And this design is supplemented with special units and with support units that include international cooperation measures in asset recovery that are going to be essential in order to successfully address these complex cases. So the prosecutor's office where I work that encompasses that empowers the investigation and criminal prosecution of complex economic crimes that are frequently associated with organized crime. Our jurisdiction includes, it has to have a socioeconomic impact, and we have many operational areas that include financing terrorism as well as asset laundering. So we have a joint as well as a comprehensive cross-cutting perspective because we want to make sure that we don't fragment our perspective of the cases. We also have a technical unit, multidisciplinary unit that includes accountants and other areas of expertise, specialization that help us in our investigations. And this is also a point of contact with the cooperation networks that includes the network involved in asset recovery. So we have three main responsibilities, Natalie. First of all, we conduct investigations, as you were asking about. These are preliminary investigations. We receive reports of crimes committed from other organizations involved in economic crime. So we launch investigations and bring forth indictments at the federal level. And we also work in cooperation with the federal prosecutors in asking for assistance in more relevant economic crimes. And together with the prosecutors on specific cases, we can create joint teams where we create a joint investigative unit or team. What's essential that I want to leave you with here is that the prosecutor has launched investigations, those most outstanding and notorious cases. I want to point out that in Argentina, the prosecutors, specialized prosecutors, have had a very effective impact in improving criminal prosecutions and prosecuting the guilty. And that's thanks to the cross-cutting approaches that I mentioned, as well as those specialized teams with various levels of expertise. That has given an additional momentum to our resources and efforts, the coordination that's going on amongst the various prosecutors so that we can, for example, all of our cases dealing with asset laundering that is associated with trafficking in persons. We articulate our efforts with the other agencies, international cooperation, asset recovery, in order to provide a comprehensive response to this challenge. Thank you very much, Prosecutor Roteta. I just wanted to just mention one thing. You talked a lot about coordination of efforts. What is that interagency relationship that you were talking about between the prosecutors of the money laundering prosecutors with the financial intelligence unit? How do you coordinate these efforts, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities? Because effectiveness in your prosecution is going to depend on that cooperation. So go ahead.
Thank you, Natalie. Well, the synergy between prevention and investigation is substantive for us to be able to have good results and outcomes in this regard, as was mentioned by the previous panelists. This is a very important relationship that allows us to achieve effective results. The FIU in Argentina operates as part of the Ministry of the Treasury, and it is that agency that receives all of the information of the subjects that are under jurisdiction. But when we talk about the Fiscal Prosecutorial Office, our financial unit, after conducting the necessary analysis, treatment, and communication of information related to money laundering and anti-terrorism activities based on the existing legislation that refers to human trafficking, is that when the unit has a confirmed suspicion about some activity related to money laundering or terrorism, they have a mandate to communicate this to the prosecutor's office that handles economic crimes. With that information from the financial unit, we began an investigation. We tried to build on the work already done. We tried to establish the case, and then we subsequently involved on the rest of the jurisdictional system, including judges. We also have a specific operational agreement across agencies, and this excellent coordination between the various units is key for any activities related to money laundering and other activities. And in Argentina, the financial intelligence unit can become a very significant contributor to our efforts. So those of us in the ministry, in the fiscal division, take the oversight role to prosecute the case. And as you all know, it's important for us to achieve the necessary coordination so that we can ensure adequate distribution of the resources and assignment of specific roles in order to ensure that they all contribute to this prosecutorial effort geared towards economic crimes. In many of our cases, we've begun with reports from the financial intelligence unit. We then develop that information, and that leads to concrete indictments. And we also request that the FIU support our investigative effort. Their function is not restricted to just reporting the information and sharing it with us whenever they suspect anything illicit taking place, but we also have their support as part of the investigation. And this is a significant and substantive collaboration, especially when we engage in early investigations related to money laundering activities. And we try to make sure that everything is in place to ensure that we can prosecute these criminal organizations and that we can dismantle all of these actors that are operating higher up the food chain, which are the most difficult to access. And clearly, the asset recovery effort is also a significant portion of all of this. But we have to begin our activities with information from the FIU. This is something that took some time, and it even included a cultural change in Argentina, but we've progressed in this regard substantially. And in Argentina, when we see activities that generate very large numbers or very large amounts of illicit gains related to the trafficking activity, then this leads to more and more investigations related to money laundering activities. And these typically tend to be linked to trafficking crimes because that type of activity generates a vast amount of illicit returns. Well, thank you, Prosecutor Roteta, for describing the overall structure of the prosecutorial exercise.
Answer you mentioned that you have the follow the money approach to combat different type of crime, including trafficking in person. In your experience, what challenges do countries face in fighting human trafficking and illicit finances, and how could those challenges be addressed?
Thank you, Natalie. Well, of course, unfortunately, there are a huge number of intersecting challenges in tackling both areas. And to pick out a few, if I may start with a couple victim-led challenges. So the first around encouraging victims to give evidence in the first place. And there's a huge amount of fear of potential violence from offenders, or a continued belief in the narrative they provide victims that somehow they're looking after their best interests. And similarly, this then contributes to an underreporting in the number of victims that there are, which also has implications for investment in tackling this threat as well. Secondly, I'd say about reaching potential victims and perpetrators before it's too late. I think here we're talking about strategic communications early, and linked to that, ensuring the right groups are able to identify the signs of a victim. There's often a misconception as well around how obvious some of the signs of coercion should be, and linked to that as well, a challenge around the different definitions around what is illegal. So those are two, I think, crucial components to consider alongside the tackling of the financing. And two others, I would say, around the coordination challenge. So a huge number of government agencies, departments, NGOs, other parts of society to come in contact with people, and the links between all of them not necessarily being obvious. And around disrupting criminal networks, which is a huge challenge, and undermining their business models. Obviously, this is tackling the finances is incredibly important at this point. And to undermine the financing of this type of crime, I think we need to consider a complex series of steps. And I think this links to some of the stuff that Gaston just set out as well. So we're thinking about a variety of challenges here. So the enabling types of financial crime, so bribes paid to corrupt officials at key points in the chain, the economy around document forgery, flows of money that enable the movement of people, and then funding linked to other types of crime areas as well, which converge with this. And also then the types of exploitation. So be it forced labor or prostitution, they have different characteristics and how profits are then moved and hidden. And so it's about kind of breaking down those different elements and the different flows having different characteristics. So in terms of some solutions, I would say around firstly strengthening mechanisms for reporting and the development of national referral mechanisms, for example, which a lot of countries already have, and expanding those further, and then working with bodies who are crucial touch points and the victims have with the state and community groups, and sort of showing them how to best use these referral mechanisms. Secondly, and obviously, as I said, a huge challenge is around tackling the finances. So the UK uses the Proceeds of Crime Act, for example, to put the burden of proof on the criminal that they have obtained their funds and assets legitimately. And if they are unable to do that, then we can freeze assets and freeze bank accounts and seize assets. But also looking at other tools within this as well. So tackling money laundering by using beneficial ownership registers, thinking about a public-private partnership approach with banks like we have in the UK to tackle suspicious transactions. So these, for example, follow certain patterns, such as repeated transactions to one account of a similar amount of money, often wired by the same system, so by Western Union, for example. So being able to pick up on those trends. And my final point would be around sort of coordination, both domestically and internationally, between all of those touch points that the victims and perpetrators have with the state, and designing interventions with all of those in mind. So particularly able to share best practice and information across different countries, particularly given how inherently transnational this crime type is. And as we sort of develop new responses, for example, in the illicit finances space. Thanks.
Thank you, Kiki, for sharing all this comprehensive work. And now I would like to continue with Dawn. Along those lines, we heard Kiki and the previous panelists about the importance of the follow the money approach in crime investigations related to human trafficking. Could you please tell Tell us a little bit of the importance of the coordination that it was very much stressed in this panel among the financial intelligence units, the law enforcement institution, as for example, such as the direction of public prosecutor, and if you can tell also how could that coordination be more efficient in your experience?
Sure. Thank you, Natalie. Coordination and cooperation are certainly critical elements in having effective systems to address money laundering and terrorist financing. And so it's extremely important for FIUs, law enforcement authorities, prosecutors, such as in this region, the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, and also for policymakers to be able to come together. This is recognized by FATF Recommendation 2, which requires countries to have measures that allow for cooperation, coordination, and information exchange between these parties. So this is something that countries actually have to do. In the context of human trafficking, where there are usually many other types of crimes involved, such as fraud, corruption, tax evasion, illegal entry, and persons just involved in other activities, renewal of licenses or fraudulent renewal of licenses, etc. It's therefore important for FIUs to have access to information from police, prosecutors, tax agencies, customs, immigration. And that would allow for discussions on trends and indicators that would make it easier for them to identify or detect human trafficking, because that's part of the issue in terms of the ability of law enforcement at times to detect that a particular type of situation does involve human trafficking. Coordination between FIUs and law enforcement authorities also has the advantage of better being able to monitor the money laundering and terrorist financing risk, and for developing common approaches to effectively dealing with those risks. Again, as I said, it's a risk-based approach for this round of mutual evaluation. So that's very important to understand the level of risk that is posed by human trafficking. In terms of mechanisms that can improve cooperation between FIUs, law enforcement authorities, and prosecutors, I would suggest the establishing of joint working groups or task forces to deal with complex money laundering and terrorist financing investigations and other operational case-based issues. So for example, you can have a task force dealing with a particular human trafficking case, designating contact points in FIUs and competent law enforcement authorities to deal with operational and other bilateral issues of common interest, signing of bilateral or multilateral memorandum of understanding between the FIU and law enforcement authorities. And we do a lot of that usually on the margins of our previously physical plenaries. You would have FIUs signing MOUs either with each other or other law enforcement authorities. Developing IT solutions for information sharing, which is very important, especially in this time of the pandemic, where everything occurs more virtually and there's a need to a greater reliance on the use of technology. And finally, holding joint trainings, including exchange of staff for training purposes and promoting internship programs. So you learn from those who may have more experience and vice versa. So there's an exchange and sharing and an understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Well, I think very three important points that to highlight specifically in terms of how to improve this cooperation. The task forces, the creation of task forces, I think it is very critical, but also to create the capability within the organizations to be able to participate very actively and productive on the task force. The MOUs, the IT solution, I think is how we can bring technology for the use and of preventing and also detecting. And of course, as I mentioned before, the joint training. Thank you, Dawn, for those points that we're taking those into account. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Now, vamos a volver a la experiencia de la OEA en la región.
Now we're going to move on to the OAS experience in the region. Gaston, what is the typology of money laundering associated with human trafficking? What is the specific work that needs to be done with the various FIUs And again, we want to emphasize the importance of bilateral and multilateral collaboration among countries to be able to address these transnational activities in an effective way.
Muchas gracias, Natalie.
Thank you, Natalie.
En sintonía con lo que se ha venido resaltando por el resto de las
I
panelistas.
have to say that I agree with what was mentioned with the other panelists in the struggle against the money laundering activities and human trafficking activities. It's very important for authorities to be able to work together with other counterparts against organized crime. The Financial Intelligence Unit becomes a key stakeholder that in parallel way could work with different agencies by providing information about the financing structure of some of these criminal organizations and their activities. So we can have some reactive activities from the FIUs and based on initial information that the FIUs can provide to the other authorities, we can then start investigations that are geared towards specific people. Now, additionally, in a more proactive way, the FIUs can receive information from their agency counterparts regarding certain illicit financial operations, especially, for example, in cases of remittances sent from other countries. And they could then intervene after the fact and try to identify any trends or any flags that could relate to illicit behavior that could be linked to human trafficking. At the regional level, in our environment, we need to share experiences. And this year, during March 3rd and 4th, I took part in the 6th International Meeting of Human Trafficking, and we discussed reparations to victims, tracing monies, and prosecuting cases related to human trafficking. In this action involving agencies in the US, we decided that we needed to work collectively to try and address these issues related to financial crimes as well as human trafficking. And so a big part of this would be to execute the necessary asset forfeiture and seizure processes to be more effective against these criminal organizations. And the focus related to following the money can become a crucial element when we're trying to fight against this egregious crime, which is human trafficking. But at the end of the day, this is something that really works. So in the Commission to Fight Human Trafficking, in our work with the Republic of Argentina, we also need to engage in this money tracing effort, which is key for us to be able to close this virtuous cycle where we can not only prosecute and indict and sentence the perpetrators, but also provide reparations for the victims. So in this way, we could retroactively redirect this illicit flow of assets and currencies, and we could garner the support from public and private institutions to try to address the issue related to human trafficking. This involves comprehensive policies, and based on the existing legislation in each country, we can seize assets and monies derived from illicit activities. And these same monies and assets that are seized can be used to strengthen the interdiction effort against these criminal organizations. The existing legislation in many countries allows for paying reparations to victims through the seizure of assets and monies derived from the activities that served to make them victims in the first place. So we also need to address human rights situations. And I wanted to mention that at the OAS during the month of March, we had a dialogue on human trafficking and sexual exploitation. and we looked at all of the financial perspectives. And this was through the Department of Transnational International Crime. And we tried to delve more deeply into the topic with the collaboration of the member states, key agencies, and other strategic partners at the international level. Thank you very much, Gaston. This leads me to a question for our prosecutor, Laura. How do you differentiate a money laundering case linked to human trafficking case? Or how do you differentiate between money laundering and a human trafficking case and the destination for the profits? Gaston mentioned some overall examples, but can you give us some more concrete examples of what you face in this regard? Yes, of course. I think it's interesting to attach some measure of dimensions to this activity because in Argentina and in many other justice systems, money laundering is a rather autonomous activity, autonomous to the actor that generated this illicit gain. But what you really see impact is the financial economic order. And so we don't have necessarily concrete victims that we can point to. And in the precedent crimes that are included in money laundering and human trafficking arena, then we tend to many times have a better linkage to victims. And so in human trafficking, there is a more explicit connection to victims that are physically and explicitly harmed, and that were harmed not just by the criminal activity that led to those profits, but they are also harmed by the effort to hide and disconnect these profits from the actions. And so as part of this, we see the aberration of human trafficking as the crime that deprives human beings of their humanity. And so there's a very clear-cut relationship there between the type of economic crime and gender inequality, because when we talk about human trafficking, as we've stated previously, women and girls and adolescent girls are disproportionately affected by this type of activity. So we do have to attach a gender perspective to this as part of our analysis. And so when we deal with human trafficking, we have to look at the gender issue because these are cases in which criminal activity that leads to economic gains is unequivocally linked to women, and they disproportionately affect women and girls. And this brings in the dimension of gender and disproportionate impact. So trying to create this differentiation between these types of crimes, then we have to look at the public policy, the inequality conditions that led to the impact on this particular population or the feminization of poverty. And so as part of this, we need to ensure that we protect the victim's right to justice, and we need to address all of these different dimensions that appear in these types of cases. And the most interesting aspect of this, which relates to what Gaston was talking about, is that we need to view this situation at the moment in which we try to ascertain what the social impact was. And we need to attach some level of dimension to the level of impact that was caused. And then we have to try to link this to the assets. And so if this was something that stemmed from a crime that was committed against a certain population, where we talk about reparations, the services and the access to rights for victims, then we need to take advantage of these assets. So we cannot do this without engaging in the necessary calculation to quantify the economic impact of these types of activities. And this goes hand in hand with generating reparations for victims, providing services and support to aid them in their situation. We all know that many times the victims themselves fall prey to these criminal organizations once again. And so when we talk about money laundering cases, this linkage becomes a key. And in Argentina, we've created a fund for victims of human trafficking, and the ministry has a commission that has oversight over human trafficking, and this is a product of a harmonious interpretation of the legislation that is in place. It's also a really good tool to repatriate some assets that have been exported through these transnational crime activities. Well, that's all fascinating, Madam Prosecutor. Clearly, we need to progress a great deal more in all of these elements that you've referred to, not just in ensuring justice for victims, but we also need to be able to assess the social harm that has been created through these activities, and we need to ensure proper reparations for the victims. I think all of this is fascinating, and clearly this will be a key topic for future dialogues.
To ask Don, a couple of months ago, the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force launched the study on financial flows for human trafficking in the Caribbean region. Could you please tell us what are the key insights, very, very brief, of the report, and what lessons can be drawn for the Latin American region? Thank you, Don.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. Just to provide some context, the report covers an analysis of data and cases that were provided by 16 CFATF members through a questionnaire on human trafficking and smuggling of migrants, and covered the years 2017 to 2019. So it presents a CFATF regional perspective on this area of human trafficking. We found that 81% of the participants had considered the threat of human trafficking in their national risk assessments, and that almost half had identified it as a high risk. So that's important to show that it is an issue within the region. Most CFATF member jurisdictions also have a basic legal framework to prosecute human trafficking and smuggling of migrants. And this is important given the fact that the crime is a transnational crime, and it will foster international cooperation between the relevant parties, as we are talking about in terms of coordination and collaboration, not only occurring at a domestic level, but also at a regional and international level. Banks and money services businesses were identified as the most common sources of suspicious activity or suspicious transaction reports relating to human trafficking and smuggling of migrants. We also saw some indicators and trends reflected, and those were that utilization of cash-intensive businesses such as bars and restaurants for this crime, utilization of third-party accounts for laundering proceeds from human trafficking, transactions of equivalent value or amount separated by a small difference, multiple individuals sending to one beneficiary for various reasons, and remittance of funds to high-risk jurisdictions for human trafficking. They identified some obstacles for investigators and law enforcement authorities in dealing with human trafficking cases, and those involved language barriers, lack of victim cooperation during investigations, and also lack of safe houses and other mechanisms to deal with the victims. The report, finally, it also provided some recommendations to assist jurisdictions in creating awareness and deterring human trafficking and smuggling of migrants activities. And some of these were the development of a Caribbean human trafficking smuggling of migrants task force amongst FIUs, specialized training courses, or mentoring for investigators and analysis with regard to human trafficking and smuggling of migrants, setting up a regional data repository for human trafficking and smuggling of migrants, statistics with the intention of filling the data gaps during research, as well as increased cooperation between jurisdictions. There really is an issue with the collection of sufficient data and statistics on these areas. Training for reporting entities on identifying indicators or red flags, public-private partnerships between FIUs, law enforcement, and reporting entities. And it's the belief that that could enhance the reporting of these types of activities, awareness, education campaigns to sensitize broader civil society, and finally, more effective recording of data and statistics as a necessary first step to accurately assess risk and mitigation measures. So that's it in a nutshell. Thank you, Natalie.
No, thank you, Dawn. Unfortunately, we have to conclude this panel. I will have just two very brief questions, one for Gaston, another one for Kiki. Gastón, en un minuto, cuéntanos, ¿alguna lección aprendida o
Just in
experiencia?
1 minute, tell us your experiences with regards to asset forfeiting and also redress for victims. Well, we've talked about asset forfeiture and restitution for victims, but let me get back to the classification of money laundering as is looked at in the context of trafficking in persons, especially in terms of the remittances. And in that regard, this is associated with the other reparation mechanisms are addressed. Remember that the countries of origin of victims are not necessarily the same countries where crimes are committed. In fact, criminal organizations need to maintain a constant flow of money that maintains their criminal enterprises going. So associated with the classifications and red flags that are basically are characteristics of the destination, as well as amounts, frequency that's sent, that these are red flags that could be related possibly with criminal organizations involved in trafficking in persons. Remember that a criminal organization has various spontaneous crimes going on. That's why it's important that the entities and agencies be aware of the multiple warnings and alerts, and then get in touch with the corresponding authorities. Now, regarding what's the specific effort that needs to be done among states and the responses that you talked about, that you were highlighting, we need to strengthen and intensify the exchange of information and actionable intelligence, where the investigators perhaps need some specific data to launch an investigation. And so frequently the process is based or hinges on getting that specific piece of information. If we have efficient mechanisms, then we will have improved, better levels of investigation. And together with that, and I don't want to overlook this, there are some specific measures dealing with illegal mining operations. For example, I want to mention that to this panel. Illegal mining has become a big issue, and in our department, we are focusing efforts. In fact, there is a project underway on illegal mining activities, especially illegal gold mining. And there are now efforts underway to strengthen the resources and capacities of agencies to detect and prosecute illegal mining, especially gold mining. And one of the most frequent categories that we've identified has to do with the cross-border transport of illegal gold, especially hidden in bags and also on persons that are crossing borders. I know we're out of time, so I don't want to extend myself too much further, but I just want to conclude by reminding everyone that at the OAS, all of us in the Multidimensional Security Secretariat, we are fully committed to combat and prosecute organized criminal groups involved in trafficking in persons. We need to develop common strategies. In particular, we need to develop tools in financial investigations so that we can recover assets. And I think we have seen that evident with all of the presentations we've heard today. It's a highly relevant issue and crucial in order to strengthen, and we need to strengthen our efforts and work together. Thank you very much once again. Thank you, Gaston.
Considering the global approach of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, could you tell us just one example that you think from other part of the world that can be very useful and informative for the work in Latin America? Thank you, Kiki.
Yes, absolutely. I had a few, but I will give you one from Romania. So I think this was a particularly successful piece of work because it took such a holistic approach. So this one was a successful strategic communications piece of work. Then the first step within that was sort of working closely with NGOs and community leaders to sort of find the best touch points to tackle this. So the one identified for this project was around schooling, and they were working with educators and students to identify some of the recruitment methods and encourage boys and girls to act as champions to prevent trafficking. And I think this was particularly successful because, as I say, it was part of a holistic approach. And so we have to tie this into a range of responses. And so for this project, for example, was working, was like looking at all non-operational activity responses in a high risk area, but alongside that, working with the traditional law enforcement training, so for investigators and bodyguards, as well as simultaneously doing outreach events and strategic communications. So, and as well as that, taking a public-private partnership approach so that large employers can also be part of the solution. So I think a really broad-ranging piece of work covering a lot of ground. So yes, I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiki. Bueno, no nos queda más tiempo, solamente agradecerles a nuestros participantes.
Well, we've run out of time. We just want to thank our participants. It's been a fantastic dialogue, and I think we're asking for more. So we'd like to thank everyone for your kind attention. And now I offer the floor to our master or mistress of ceremonies, Adela Barrio. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you for the marvelous presentations that you have undertaken. And as we know, you are saving lives and you're improving the lives of all of us. So for all of us and all of you who have accompanied us, we know that from the very beginning, we've had a high level of involvement and participation. So, and for those who haven't filled out this survey, if you could please give us a hand with that. It's a very brief, just click onto the code right here. Your feedback is vital for assessing the success of our events. So on behalf of this fourth technical dialogue on trafficking in persons in Latin America and the Caribbean, would like to thank you all very much. And we hope to have you join us during our next dialogue. So until then, thank you.